Hello and a really warm welcome to everyone. Thanks a lot for coming to join us today. This is our first talk so far, and it's been quite a collective effort getting it together. So we thought we'd start by just introducing ourselves a bit and introducing kind of what the project is and why we're here, and then we'll get onto the main speakers as quickly as possible. So we're a group of people who are based and living and working in different countries and in very different areas. So people from community activists to journalists and artists, right the way through to people working in international organisations and government. And we've been really lucky to be brought together through a programme called the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity, which is based at LSE's International Inequalities Institute. And we, in kind of all of us in some way, I guess, are working to try to challenge and try to overcome some of the various different forms of inequality that have existed for a long, long time, but which are being currently exposed in very sad and tragic ways across the world at the moment. And what we really want to do here, I think, is to come together as a group and to join others who are talking about and thinking about some of the social and economic effects of COVID-19, and to, I guess, to lend our voice and do what we can to help raise the visibility and raise the profile of some alternatives that are there, some of which we're seeing at the moment, and to, yeah, I guess, look for some different ideas, some different structures, some different policies, some different ways of doing things, so that we can, hopefully not go back to the same systems and structures that are failing so many people at the moment. So that's the broad picture of what we're doing. But saying all that, I guess this is our very first attempt at a talk like this. It's the first attempt on Zoom, and it's the first time a lot of us, if any of us, have spoken on this platform. So we hope it goes well. The plan is to build a series of talks around this, series of talks like this, and also some other activities, hopefully, that build on the talks as we move forward. We're really, really keen to link up more widely. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback and ideas, and really hope we can keep working together and developing these kind of things as we go forward. So that's just about it. You can get in touch with us. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do so at AFSEE COVID-19, which is AFSEE COVID-19 at atlanticfellows.org. And we're using a hashtag today, lockdown is a luxury, if you want to tweet or share anything that's coming out of the talks. That's just about it, I think. But before we start, the theme for today is lockdown is a luxury. And I just want to take a moment just to acknowledge how fortunate a lot of us are to be here and kind of taking part in talks like this at the moment, while so many people have lost their lives or lost friends and family, and while millions of people are suffering terribly at the moment, both because of the virus and also because of a shocking lack of basic resources and basic social protections. So with that in mind, I guess, and on that note, I'm going to pass you over to my good friend and colleague, Priyanka, who is going to take over the hosting from here, and she's going to tell you a bit about her context as well. Okay, I'm going to pass you on. Enjoy the talk.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks very much. Hey, everybody. There are about 86 people on this call today. This is our first online conversation, and as Jack said, it's going to be around lockdown is a luxury. I thought we could start off. Let me begin with a verse from an Indian poet, in fact, a poet from my city, Delhi, Akhil Katyal. The poem is called, I'm going to be flitting between a different screen and this one, so apologize for that. The poem is called Coping Mechanisms in the Times of Corona. Exercise with simple home equipment. Before it assumes equipment, it assumes home. Work from home assumes both. Sneaking out for a walk takes for granted a place to sneak back in. Simple recipes to try on your own. Needs a stove, cooking oil, and veggies someone has grown, and grain. Learning a new skill. Keep stimulating your brain. Taking a new course, all need leisure. Finding pleasure in solitude, somehow still, despite all promises and luck, needs a full stomach. Almost 1/3 of the world, that is around 2 billion people, have been forced into some sort of a lockdown. issued in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. For those of us, like people like us, who have the privilege of withdrawing into comfortable isolation, who can work from home, and who have enough money to sort of weather this storm, lockdown and social distancing are effective options. But what about the poor, the majority of the working population of the world, who already are facing entrenched social and economic inequalities? Is the lockdown an unaffordable luxury then? Earlier this month, our friends from, because of the network that we are, Saida told us that a stampede broke out in Nairobi's Kibera slum, where people had queued up for food aid. Then in Johannesburg's settlements, people are waking up at 2 a.m. in the morning to queue up, to select a queue they will stand in, that will guarantee them food that day. In India, we're in the fifth week of the lockdown, and yet migrant workers, their families, children, pregnant women, and elderly are still out on the roads, walking hundreds of kilometers in the hot sun, on foot to make their way back home. There were 2 stories in 1 week from India. A 20-year-old migrant worker who worked in an iron casting facility cycled 1,700 kilometers across India back home. And the same week, a 12-year-old tribal girl who worked in chili farms, died after trekking for 3 days and about 100 kilometers from home. In the US, in 5 weeks, 26 million people have become jobless, and that number is only growing. The point is that there is no single story to the lockdown. But what the pandemic has made clear is that already entrenched and established inequalities are no longer invisible. They are intensified and they're out in the open. And I'm going to borrow Saida's words here that she written in a recent piece. Your socio-economic status will determine where you will be during the curfew. There will be no places for the homeless to go to, no toilets for people living in informal settlements, no safe passage for pregnant women going into labor at night, no protection from increased sexual violence, no food and social protection measures. So today, we've got a panel of speakers who come from different contexts and different regions, who will share their experience, expertise, and insight into understanding how the pandemic has thrown up the inequalities that we were already fighting and facing. Before I introduce the first speaker, allow me to share where I am located and what's happening here. We're in day 32 of the lockdown in India. I'm here in Delhi, where I live in an affluent gated neighborhood. I'm able to work from home, and we're not running short of any supplies at the moment. But outside my home, in my own neighborhood, the situation is very, very different. Since the lockdown began, about 9 government hunger centers have opened up in my neighborhood, in government school properties, in police stations, on the roadside, under flyovers, where lunch and dinner are being served to people that live around this area, who provide services to this particular neighborhood. So as after the lockdown began here in India, we from our home started a small community kitchen where we managed to make about 60 to 100 meals a day, mostly for lunchtime. We're on day 25 right now. We've been supplying these meals to one of the centers along with fruits. It's been 3 to 4 weeks, but the queues are not getting any shorter. In fact, it seems like workers and families are running out of cash to cook even a single meal a day and end up at one of these centers. We see the private security guards of our own neighborhood at these centers, some of whom don't have homes to return to, some of whom have not been paid for 2 months. We see rickshaw drivers, rickshawalas who don't have customers. We see street vendors whose businesses are shut down. We see domestic workers and sweepers, most of whom are women. We see construction workers and their families. We've got labor chocks where workers who congregate there to pick up jobs on a daily basis. There are plumbers, electricians, carpenters, welders, carpet weavers, cobblers and tailors, and so many more workers who are building our cities but have remained invisible, underpaid, unprotected, uninsured, and poor. They're, forget the virus, at this point, they're facing certain poverty and hunger. I also want to tell you about my neighborhood a little bit. It was in the news this last week. One of the families in this neighborhood tested positive for coronavirus, and their immediate suspicion fell on their guard, who happened to be a Muslim and may or may not have attended a mass event that happened in March before the lockdown was even announced. So this family went ahead and lodged a complaint with the police against this guard. The guard was painted as a super spreader by the media, and already vilified minority community in this country was further alienated. An informal worker lost his job, and other residents in this neighborhood were asked to be on alert about their guards and workers and domestic workers. Last week, the results of the guard's test came out, and he tested negative. The family apparently had travel history, which they neglected to mention. What I'm trying to say is that in the same neighborhood, there are multiple experiences of this lockdown. The guard and I are weathering this lockdown in cruelly different ways, in highly unequal ways. This is just the story of my neighborhood in Delhi. Think about the massive unequal city that it is, and think about more cities like Delhi that are built on the backs of migrant labor and informal workers like Mumbai and Bangalore. There are villages and towns in India which are now being hit at once by reverse migration, by economic slowdown, rotting crops, and extremely poor health infrastructure. Think about those countries where authoritarian regimes have already, where human rights are already so threatened. They're using this as an opportunity to impose further draconian measures and visit violence upon vulnerable bodies. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Saida. Saida Ali, who wrote a recent piece on the police violence in Kenya at the time of the pandemic. Saida is an intersectional feminist and an international policy analyst and a senior fellow at AFSI, based in Kenya. Saida, over to you.
Thank you very much, Priyanka. I just want to share a little story first. This morning, my daughter, who is 11 years old, asked me why our Zoom talk lockdown is a luxury. And because she found the use of the word luxury and lockdown a contradiction, because she's understood the measures we are taking with the schools being closed, with her staying at home, with us staying at home and self-isolating. Those measures are meant to protect us and for us to not spread, or for COVID-19 not to be spread when we stay at home. And I explained to her a little bit about inequalities, but in order for me to get her to understand, I had to talk to her about our house help, Abby. I have a woman in her 40s who comes to our house, not permanently employed because she cleans a number of houses in my neighborhood. She comes to our house twice a week. And as soon as the government of Kenya announced that we are going to be experiencing the curfew as part of the response to stopping the spread, I spoke to her and I asked her to stop, coming to work. And I had to explain to her why, which is what I was explaining to my daughter this morning. And I said to her not to worry, I was going to continue paying her. Then she said something to me about the other house where she works. And she said, your neighbor would never do that. So I will just continue working until the day he stops me from coming to work, which of course eventually he did. But for my daughter this morning, it was important for her to understand the difference between the children that are living in Kibera and Mathare, which are some of the slums in Nairobi, which she already knows because then we've had interactions with those communities, and I go often to do my work in those neighborhoods. And I try to explain to her that there are people who, even if they have to stay at home, they will actually not have food because they have to work every day. People like Abby who, if they don't get out to go to work, that's it, because then they are employed. It's not really employment. It's they go to work informally so that then they can earn either at the end of the week or at the end of the day, depending on what the arrangement is. And at the end of it all, I mean, it was important for me to see, even though we've been having this lockdown, partial lockdown in Kenya, that there are a number of us who may have, or for children who have children, may need to do more. Yes, one, to support our children, because then children are experiencing a whole lot of world in their heads right now, not being able to go out to play, not being able to go to school. But the reason I'm wanting to raise this first before I go into what Kenya's response has been is because we see children in informal settlements that go to public schools that have not and will not have access to the kinds of things that would allow them to continue learning. And even if we say that now, for those of us who have children in private schools, there's some e-learning of sorts going on, those children are not going to be able to have that. And that already points to the kind of digital inequalities we have in our countries. So as we speak now, and as of yesterday, Kenya confirmed 336 cases of COVID-19. We've had a total of 94 cases that have recovered, and we've had 14 deaths. What has happened is that we've had the government respond by initiating certain measures, and I'm just going to try and share from. No, I'm not able to do that. I was going to share the screen for you to just see some of the things that our government has put in place, but I'll just say them quickly. One, from 27th of last month, we've had a daily curfew all over Kenya that starts from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. of the next day. Kenya has suspended all travel movements into and out of the country. We don't have, within the country, air transport has been suspended. There are restrictions on movements in and out of Nairobi, and what as now, some boundaries that have now been redefined as part of Nairobi Metropolitan. Then some of the coastal towns such as Mombasa, Kwale, Kilifi, and Mandera County, which is in the northeastern part of Kenya, there is no in or out movement. With, you can move within those cities or counties, but not out of them. Bars, pubs, and nightclubs have been closed. Social clubs all closed. Sports and recreation centers closed. And learning centers, and this means schools, all levels have been closed. And this is what I began by explaining in relation to those of us who have the privilege, and I really want to emphasize privilege, to access or to pay for a different kind of education that is not what's provided by government. Then those schools immediately started initiatives for e-learning for their students. Public transport, there is mandatory sanitation, and this, I mean, use of hand sanitizers as you go in and out of the bus stations and the buses, regular sanitization of public transport vehicles, provision of hand sanitizers for all passengers, and observing social distancing in those buses, or what we call matatus. They are smaller vans and coaches. That in itself presents a certain issue or concern that I have raised in the blog that Priyanka mentioned, because if you're talking about social distancing for real, you know, it's really almost impractical when I have to sit next to someone in a bus or, you know, a few seats away from someone, and whether it would be practical for those who run such public transport to reduce the number to the actual proper, or to be able to observe the actual proper distancing. There are many other things that have been put in place or closed, and there are a few that have been allowed, such as food markets, shopping malls and supermarkets, banks, media houses, medical facilities, hospitals. There's a bit of door-to-door deliveries, restaurants where you can go and take away your food, telecommunication companies, private security companies, and so on. But I want to just quickly move to the issue of the vulnerable in our Kenyan society. Basically, delivery of care packages in terms of response by government and in the different counties is already now starting, but I feel that there was a slowness in how this started. So there's cash transfers that have been planned to the elderly, orphans, and vulnerable members in society. However, for those of us who've worked with such groups, we've raised questions around how cash transfers are being done and how vulnerable groups or those already living at the margins because of inequalities, how they're going to access that. There are families with children that have severe disabilities, for example, and some of those are headed by females. There are families where you have elderly people that are actually, they don't have support. So cases, for instance, of women, elderly women who take care of HIV AIDS orphans. So they would be the ones that they need the care, but they're also providing care. And so it is these groups that some of us have raised concerns based on how things have just gotten worse. But I want to also say it's not all that, you know, grime. There are things that are happening, shows of show of solidarity and charity from ordinary Kenyans, you know, beyond what the government is doing. But we're also saying it should never be about the charity that for me as Saida or for my neighbor, that, I mean, that is very good, but it should never be just about that. It should be about the social protection mechanisms that our government and other governments put in place. It should be about what will be provided to ensure that people can access health facilities when there are emergencies because of the curfew. I mean, there's been violence, not just in Kenya. There's been cases of violence by state agents in Kenya, in Uganda, in Rwanda. There's been a lot of denial in Tanzania, you know, from the government, showing that there isn't need for panic. We're not asking for panic. We just need proper response. You know, you have a place like Rwanda where the response has included the government identifying certain hotels as quarantine centers and the government actually paying for that, you know, so that then cases are identified quickly and people are quarantined in a humane way, no need for violence. But as Priyanka mentioned at the beginning, part of what we've seen is a loss of freedoms, you know, for people. There's already restrictions on movements, and what we are saying is that there is no need to make it worse already. And if I, you know, in just finalizing now, I just want to say the gendered kind of implications of this pandemic have shown us how, you know, the vulnerabilities and the differences we have because of social class, the social and economic inequalities, the poverty. I was saying to a friend and to Karen of AFSI the other day that COVID-19 is basically taking us back. We are on rewind mode in terms of achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals for the UN. And you know there's already a new research by the United Nations University that shows that 8% of the world population is going to, is predicted that we're going to have 8% living in poverty. I mean, I will stop there and perhaps come back to more discussion based on questions, so that then in the interest of time, we get to hear from the others. But thank you very much. This has been a very useful engagement in terms of reflections.
Thanks, Saida. Thank you so much talking to us. I think a lot of what you have said, especially around digital inequalities and the gendered impacts of COVID, are very true in the South Asian context as well. We're also facing, like you said, I think in terms of feminism, we've gone back 50 years to fight the same battles over and over again, whether girls will get access to internet to be able to complete their studies, to remain competitive in today's age. Please send in your questions in the chat. We're going to try and open up the question session after all the speakers have spoken. We'll move on to our next speaker, who is Kripa Basnyat from Nepal. Kripa is a feminist activist who's working on gender equity and inclusion based out of Kathmandu. She's also an AFSI fellow based at the LSE. She's most recently written about the Nepalese workers, the migrant workers who are stuck on the India-Nepal border in Kripa, over to you.
Thank you, Priyanka, for your lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Kripa from Nepal, and currently I'm engaged in research on domestic care migrant workers and broadly on situation of women migrant workers in the Gulf region. I feel this talk particularly is very timely, considering the current ordeals of Nepali migrant workers. So today is 25th April, and it's a coincidence that 5 years ago today, Nepal was hit by this massive earthquake, 7.6 magnitude, which claimed almost 9,000 people's lives and injured more than 22,000 people. So the experience was traumatic. It still is unforgettable. And now we're facing another crisis, a global crisis, I would say, where COVID-19 is putting more marginalized and vulnerable people at risk. At the moment, so far we have 48 confirmed cases where 10 people have already recovered. So Nepal is taking very conservative approach of lockdown, where international airport, everything, basically mobility is restricted. We introduced lockdown just 2 days before India, in fact, and which also created a huge crisis for migrant workers in India, where they wanted to get back home. Nepal has extended its lockdown till April 27th, and India has decided to extend it till May 4th. And I'm sure this is going to be extended again because we don't really have a proper healthcare system in place. So this is the best they're proposing that they can do. And because of this restriction in mobility has also created difficulty for us to mobilize our organization, more people to go out and help people and create more awareness on coronavirus. In comparison to earthquake, where people were able to mobilize themselves. And because of this restriction on mobility, particularly, the informal workers who are in Kathmandu, were forced to go back home on the foot, like Priyanka shared initially. Similar thing happened in India. And there are many people still stranded on Indo-Nepal border, and there are many still stranded in Gulf countries. So I would show you a few pictures just to give you an idea of what it's like. I'll just share this. Just a second. So, so if you see, this is the first picture that we got from Dharchula, which is the Indo-Nepal border just beyond Mahakali River, where more than 500 migrant workers, you can see in this picture, are protesting against the government of Nepal to let them in. And in totality, there are 1,100 people currently quarantined by the Indian government. They were 14 people in 2 different instances where they tried to cross the river. And there were 7 people who were able to cross the river, and they were arrested by the Nepali police force. So it's also how you basically treat them as criminals, which is also problematic. So they've been quarantined in different 5 locations in Dharchula, which is just a neighboring border. And you can see they are practicing social distancing while they are meeting or attending these sessions, motivational speech sessions. But there are other pictures where they are in their accommodation and they can't really practice social distancing. So the title is very apt in terms of lockdown is a luxury, right? And there are also cases where informal workers, basically migrant workers with their family, are going back home on their foot. So the relief package was providing 5 kg rice to these people and half liter of oil, which is nothing. You need money as well for gas, for other resources, which they don't really have, and they don't have money to pay their rent. So they were forced to go back home, and the local resident also pushed them out. There are cases of 2 women dying on their way back home because of dehydration. And there was a man who fell down from the suspension bridge because it was blocked by the community members. So they were not let in. So we can already see that they're not accepted where they are at the moment, and they're not accepted where they're from. This is another picture from UAE where migrant workers, they are homeless. They did not have money to pay their rent, so they're out in the open. And non-resident Nepal Association did cover 1 month rent, but now they're clueless where to go, where to get food from. So this is also one of the reality that we can see. And the government is also struggling because there are almost 10 million people out in the Gulf countries. And if they happen to come back, then is there a facility to quarantine them is something that needs to be thought about. And yesterday itself, there was a meeting between between the diplomats from West Asian countries and also Pakistan and Malaysia, the representatives from Nepal, where they were discussing of how Nepali migrant workers can be repatriated to get the data basically and to arrange their repatriation process. So it's a monumental challenge for even a very well endowed government. Is for us to see how that's taken care of. And they are actions taken by the local citizens like this, like they were, messages being floated around because it was really problematic looking at migrant workers walking on the foot back home without even wearing slippers. There were pregnant women, lactating women with their small children. And this was particularly a campaign that the some of us we undertook, and we've been pressurizing the government to take action, and the government has also made arrangements for local buses to take them home. And sadly, there was a news this morning where there was an accident and one of the person died. So this is the picture that I wanted to show. And I'll show myself now. So there are organizations taking their initiation themselves, where organizations have given their shelters, or hotels have given their property for quarantine facilities. There are also women's rights organizations who have been involved in cooking hot food and distributing them to people in need in Kathmandu particularly. And on April of 20th, the Women's Rights Network, along with UN Women, they presented a feminist and queer charter of demands to the government so that the responses to COVID-19 do not magnify or exacerbate inequalities and vulnerabilities. It's something I think which other civil society organizations can also do in other countries. However, I feel that there has been very pick and choose kind of intervention by the government, where few so-called upper class citizens were chartered back home from Wuhan, China, whereas there's little empathy towards the so-called lower class citizens to get them home. And it's really alarming and shocking that local elected representatives are not doing much. There are issues like stigmatization of people who are affected by COVID-19. There were also death threats against this person. The second case, which got informed, and she also got death threats and rape threats, saying that she's also a super spreader, and similarly what Priyanka shared in terms of spreading Islamophobia. Similar case happened where the cases doubled up in one day, and the whole blaming, shaming was towards the Muslim community. So I guess in Nepal, Nepal's community news agency, even the government is getting influenced by the decision that is taken in India or the community. So I would only like to suggest, like, what particularly can we do is maybe looking at immediate measures of having well-resourced, gender-friendly quarantine with skilled health workers, and also spread awareness around coronavirus, where people are not stigmatized. And the bigger crisis remains where more migrant workers might come back. Then what does reverse migration mean for women is something that we might want to look at. And how can we observe the returning migrant workers back home, through, and suggestion would be maybe through entrepreneurial development projects, making provision of soft loans. So for me, I would say that, there are cases of increasing domestic violence, rape cases, which is higher than before. but there's a need to have gender disaggregated data and intersectional approach to responses. And I don't think we're paying attention to that. And lastly, I would like to say that women have been on the forefront in 2015 earthquake, and even now to mitigate the impacts of disaster. Women have been on the front line and they've shown that they can lead. So it is high time that we recognize their work and accept it as a decent work. And it's high time we engender our responses to COVID-19. And the global WHO approved lockdown is an unaffordable luxury, which only few can afford. These are extraordinary times, which requires extraordinary responses. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kripa. I think we're still taking questions at the end of the session. I'm sorry, I think I was not audible the last time. I hope I am audible now. Kripa, thank you for showing us those images. I think just seeing these visuals brings home of what, how lockdown is a luxury is just not true. It doesn't work in so many contexts. We'll come back to many of the points that you have raised. So we'll move on to Tracy, just to keep the interest of time here. We'll move on to our next speaker. Tracy is from South Africa. She's the Senior Advocacy Officer at the International Budget Partnership in South Africa. She works with grassroots organizations to advocate for improved basic services to informal settlements across cities in South Africa. Her work also seeks to promote budget accountability in government. And since the pandemic started, I think she and her team have been quite at the forefront to address concerns emerging out of informal settlements. Tracy, over to you.
Thanks, Priyanka. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for making time on a Saturday to attend the talk. It's a privilege for me to be able to share some of my experience with you. So I'm sitting in Cape Town in South Africa. South Africa has had a very hard lockdown since the 26th of March, very similar to what Saida described in Kenya. Our movement's been severely restricted, our borders are closed, schools are closed. There's heavy police presence to monitor people's movements. Government has also complemented that with a big social relief program. But I think from a health perspective, those measures have helped us towards flattening the curve. But it's had huge social and economic repercussions particularly for communities that were already vulnerable. South Africa has very high rates of inequality and poverty, and that's been exacerbated to levels that we've never seen before. So that's a context in which we're operating now. I'm going to take this opportunity to share a little bit more with you about the work that I've been doing with colleagues at International Budget Partnership South Africa, as well as our grassroots partners that we work with. And I have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay, so I thought it would be important to just give you a little bit of context to informal settlements in South Africa. We're a population of just over 58 million, and 14% of our residents live in informal settlements. So that ranges between 2.9 and 3.6 million people, up to 1.5 million households. And these are quite old estimates from 2011, because that's when our last national census was undertaken. So those figures have definitely increased. The National Department of Housing estimates that we have 2,700 informal settlements in the country, and most of those are located in our major cities. Cape Town alone has over 400 informal settlements, and they're quite spread out across the city. So it represents a huge challenge for government to try and provide adequate services for these communities. And speaking more specifically to our topic today, I think my colleagues have spoken before me. have already answered the question about why lockdown is a luxury, and it's even more so in the context of informality. It's a virtually impossible ask because these communities are extremely dense. Overcrowding is just a daily, a part of people's daily lives. People are living in shacks. They're not safe. They're not considered adequate by any measure. When it's hot outside, it's extremely hot inside a shack. When it's really cold outside, it's extremely cold inside. So the idea of shelter in place holds a completely different meaning. Communities are relying on shared toilets. In the picture on the top right-hand corner, you'll see a row of toilets, which would have been provided by government. And you have dozens of families sharing toilets. The government's supposed to provide a service cleaning those toilets. It's often done irregularly, which presents a massive health risk, as you can imagine. Communities are also sharing water points, so taps that are meant to be shared again by dozens of families. And water supply and water quality can be issues with these taps. And the notion of stocking up on food and supplies is just not an option because these households are facing severe poverty, and these communities have very high rates of unemployment anyway. So it's a really extremely difficult set of circumstances that these communities are having to grapple with in the midst of a crisis. I just wanted to illustrate for you what that actually looks like. This is an aerial image of an informal settlement in Cape Town called Appu. This picture is from 2016, so it's a bit dated, but you'll see the blue dots are marking water points. So those would just be taps, which are for communal use. And the light blue circumference is just indicating a 25-meter radius. So it gives you a sense of the distance that people are from those taps. In this particular settlement, 87 households have to rely on one tap. So that's how dense the settlement is. And how spread out, the taps are, making it quite inaccessible. So that's just to give you a sense of, just one example of the conditions that communities are facing. And water and sanitation obviously are critical from a health perspective. So a lot of the work we've been doing at the IBP has focused on water and sanitation. And I just want to share with you a little bit about how our work has changed over the last few weeks. So before COVID-19, we were working with grassroots partners supporting community-based monitoring, and still focused on water sanitation and solid waste services. And it was really about mobilizing communities to hold government accountable. So giving them information on what types of services they should be receiving, who in government is responsible for services, how budgets are meant to be designed, and for them to be able to interrogate city budgets, and really capacitate them and to build their agency to engage with government, and work with them to actually advocate for better services. And this is a very sort of ground-based set of methodologies that we utilized. And when COVID-19 hit and our lockdown was implemented, it was impossible to mobilize communities around these issues and services. So we had to think quite differently about how we do that. And one of the things that emerged very quickly was there wasn't a lot of resources and information on what residents could do around hygiene when they're sharing water and sharing toilets with other people. So our first set of initiatives focused on just raising awareness and sharing some tips. And these are things that we couldn't find elsewhere. We had to speak to health experts. We spoke to community members in informal settlements to put together a set of tips for how to maintain good hygiene, because even the notion of washing your hands for 20 seconds is a privilege, because you need to have a tap and you need to have soap, and many people just don't have that in the context of an informal settlement. So we published this pamphlet, and it's been translated, I think, into 8 languages now. Our partner organizations are on the bottom there. I have to give a shout out to them because they do a lot of the work on the ground. Government came to the table with us. We had various government departments asking to have their logo put on the pamphlet, and they also shared and distributed that to various communities. So this initiative on its own was really important for partnership building, and I think we've just been astounded how our politics in some places has been put aside for the greater good, which has been very encouraging for us to see. The second big campaign, which we initiated a few weeks after rolling out the pamphlet, was focused on needing to find a way to still enable and empower communities to monitor basic services when they are not able to physically meet and gather in the way that we typically would. And what we did in partnership with a whole number of organizations, you can see at the bottom of the screen, was implement a basic mobile survey. So we sent residents every week 3 questions, asking them about whether their settlement has clean water, has clean toilets, and whether the solid waste has been collected. We gave them airtime for them to be able to respond to the survey, and they sent the responses back to us. And we've been doing this for a few weeks now. We're covering 335 informal settlement residents across 133 settlements across 5 major cities in South Africa. And what we've done with that information has been to take this to government and say, these are the settlements where there are major problems. Either there's a pipe burst, the toilets aren't being cleaned, the toilets are broken, or there are not enough toilets for residents. And to work with them to channel their response. I will say that the South African government in our cities were very quick to respond with services. So they sent out additional water tanks and then some other temporary measures around sanitation as part of the emergency response. But what was really lacking in the approach was the inclusion of the voices of these communities and for them identifying exactly what their needs are. And there's been many stories of city governments using this information to actually direct the response, which has been empowering for residents. So we've been able to give them that feedback to say, thank you for telling us about the tap in your settlement that doesn't have water. We've engaged the city government, and government has responded with providing water in some of those spaces. So the pamphlet or the report you see in front of you is a national report, which we've used in our social media and to raise more public awareness. We indicate some hotspots in red, which are the main areas of concern. We're finding that very recently government's done a really good job around water provision, but sanitation remains a big concern. And this really helps to shape our advocacy. And through this, we've built good relationships with cities. There obviously is a lot that still needs to be done. But we thought it was important to highlight some of the good news, as I said, to keep us motivated and to keep the government officials motivated to some extent. Because I think they're facing an insurmountable set of challenges. So this is available on our website. We'll do this every second week. And through this process, I think just reflecting on some of the things that we've learned is that communities, their needs are changing. It's an incredibly dynamic space. So government provides water, sanitation has improved, but people don't have food. So we're needing to also adapt and respond to those needs and to convey that message up to bigger organizations and government who can respond at a much bigger scale. I think we've learned a lot about effective ways of partnering. So certainly with some municipal governments, our partnership has strengthened and we're looking towards the future. So we're constantly looking at what we can do next. And even once a crisis passes, I think we remain hopeful about building on the strength of those partnerships. So there is still a lot to be done around basic services. It's an ongoing challenge, and it has been for many decades. I think it's just been exacerbated by the outbreak of COVID-19. But there's also been a lot of collaboration and cooperation, which I don't think we would have seen otherwise. And I think that's what's kept us motivated. So yeah, I'll just stop there. Thanks for giving me the space to share this work.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm sorry, I think I'm having some trouble with the mute and unmute button. Thank you so much, Tracy. That was, we really did need some good news. And I think your presentation illustrates how organizations can work with communities on ground and how governments and partnering works in developing an ongoing response to a situation that's evolving as well. There are a number of questions that I probably would like the speakers to keep in mind. There are a bunch of questions on the gender, what is the impact on gender inequalities because of COVID? Maybe our speakers can think about and come back to it when we open up the floor for questions. There's also another question on how COVID has been a great unveiler, showing the importance of so-called low status jobs. You know, we're now realizing, or probably we already knew, we knew this all along, but the essential workers are out there doing their jobs. So how have you seen the politicization of those for whom lockdown is a luxury? I'd like the speakers to keep these things in mind. I think from the first couple of talks, what has emerged is how important cash is to this situation of the pandemic, how quickly a lot of the vulnerable populations have run out. Our last speaker for the session today is Appu Suresh, a senior APSI fellow and a former investigative journalist from India. Appu is researching on inequality in India and based on new unpublished data. So Appu, if you can take over.
Yeah, am I audible? I hope so. Thanks, Priyanka, and thanks everyone for joining us for this. So I want to start on a very cynical note, actually. This very conversation that we're having right now is something like lockdown is a luxury. It's only because it's lockdown is a luxury. And I also want to acknowledge the near absence of those who don't have the luxury during a lockdown. In fact, as a matter of fact, they never had that luxury in their position, because even when under normal circumstances, they could have never joined this conversation, because that is because of the long structural inequality that has been in around, and we are not able to address it. So I'm going to make my small presentation in 5 parts. So number one, I'm going to give a little bit of background of India, which is a place that I'm familiar with and where my research is based on. And second is the state of affairs before the lockdown began. And that's in terms of giving, based on my research, what is a level of inequality that is in India. And the third part will be on in terms of how those inequalities kind of manifested. And we saw how it played out during a crisis situation like the lockdown that's been going on for the last 32 days. And fourth, again, I get back to the cynical myself, that is the consequence of this lockdown, and trying to relate how inequality will lead to a different kind of, not just economic inequality, but it will also lead to, sorry, not just economic consequences, but it will also lead to social and political consequences. And I would like to end on a hope that some of the suggestions that we will discuss here will take the way forward. Now, first of all, to give you a quick background, post-2000, the reason why the global poverty declined is mostly because of 2 countries, China and India. They're lifting out millions out of the poverty is a main contributing factor for the global poverty levels to come down. And I'll be specifically talking about India, and also discussing, did India actually lifted millions out of poverty? A key cutoff date that is important for each one of us to participating in this conversation to kind of remember, for the point of both reference as well as for analysis, is 1993. Because 1993 is exactly 2 years after India introduced a series of economic reforms and embraced a globalized, liberalized economy. So in 1993, the data that I'm providing right now of poverty data is from the World Bank. In 1993, there were 875.1 million Indians who lived below the poverty line, if you go by $1.9 per day measurement. And in 2015, which is what the latest data that is available from World Bank, for the same $1.9 per day poverty line, there were 411.4 million Indians who still lives under the poverty line. So it will look like that we have reduced the poverty by almost 50%. So in fact, that kind of reflects in the headcount ratio, as it called. It's like the proportion of people living under poverty line from 43.8 to 14.2. Now, I just want to play around a little bit with the numbers right now. So if we raise the poverty line number from 1.9 to 3.2, in fact, the World Bank prescribes that for a lower middle income country like India, the ideal poverty line should be $3.2 per day. Now, what happens now? In 1993, if we consider $3.2 per day as the poverty line, there were 1,488.8 million Indians who lived under the poverty line. And that is like 1.4 billion for those, to get a sense of number. So now in 2015, that number get reduced by roughly 200 million, but still 1.2 billion or 1,288 million Indians still lived under the poverty line. This is what we're talking about is $3.2. So the reason why I gave these two numbers is to give you a sense that majority, even when we drastically reduced poverty, majority of Indians still lived under somewhere between $1.9 and $3.2. So that is like, despite the fact that the poverty number of people living under poverty came down to 400 million, if we just reconsider this $3.2, they were still living closer to the poverty line, which we call as at the risk of poverty. So it is not as if, and again, remember, in 1993, the size of the Indian economy was 279.3 billion, whereas in 2015, or I mean, actually, as we speak now, it has risen 10 times to 2.7 trillion or 2,726 billion. So despite the fact the size of the Indian economy has increased 10 times, the majority of the population was still hovering around this poverty line of $1.9 per day. So that's the background in which we are talking. And now I move on to the state of affairs at the level of inequality just before the lockdown started. And this is based on my research, which is using cash data, which I have accessed post demonetization. For those who are not familiar with what is demonetization, that is in a sudden move and a surprising move, on November 8, 2016, Government of India withdrew two high-value currencies, which accounted for 86% of all the currencies in circulation. So based on that, and that was given a 50 days window to kind of get it exchanged with a new series of notes. And this data is based, I mean, my research is based on the data that I accessed from there. So why cash is a question that might just come to your mind. And in fact, like Priyanka pointed out, this is actually the kind of time that we realize the value of cash. And to take it a little more philosophical or historical context, that many Indians have dealt with political and social inequality with the ability to pay off. And I think that's probably, that is the case with many of the countries in which slavery was still in existence, because probably the only one way a slave could buy out his freedom was by paying money to his lord. Now, and currency or no, I mean, the currency is a very basic economic instrument. So everybody has it, like at some level. So by studying how the currency has been distributed in a country like India, we get a sense of how equally or unequally is the basic economic resources that's been shared. So we can very well kind of get an estimate of how probably the other economic resources, which is more formally structured, will be distributed. So here are the big numbers. The top 1% of Indians held 62.3% of all the currencies in circulation. And in absolute numbers, this will come around 10 million. So definitely, yes, there are a lot of people who are who hold that top one, who comes in the top 1%. That's just because of the size of the country. And the top 0.1% held 33% of all the currency in circulation. So that is the kind of numbers that we're looking at. It's highly unequal. And I try to estimate the inequality up to the district level, or even sometimes up till the sub-district level. That is, we use three inequality measurements. That is Gini, Atkinson Index A1, and GE1. For those who are not familiar with these measurements, I mean, don't worry, because these are just 3 different ways in which you can, there are 3 different measurements of inequality. So the whole purpose of using 3 different measurements is try and triangulate where is the likely level of inequality, right? So Gini is something that a lot of you might be familiar with, is the most commonly used inequality measurement. So currently, according to the World Bank, India's Gini is somewhere 0.35, which is as good as or bad as UK. Whereas according to my measurement, it is 0.71. So, I mean, 0 is in a Gini measurement is anywhere between 0 to 1, and 0 is case of perfect equality, and 1 is perfect inequality, and 0.71 is pretty high up there, and which is a similar measurement that you get for even Atkinson index. A1 is 0.62, G1 is 3.10. Just goes to say that the cash inequality in itself was very, very high. Now we'll move on to the next section of this conversation, which is how did that impact people during a lockdown, right, or an emergency of health emergency of this magnitude. Now there was, I mean, as I just mentioned, we were witnessing very high level of inequality, and that came out in the most tragic and horrific ways during this lockdown. Many of you will, if you just do a random Google search of what happened in India during that, since the lockdown began, you'll see many migrants on their foot, some walking even 600 to 1,000 kilometers to try and reach back home. And they were doing so because there was no way they could survive in these urban urban centers where they were working as migrant laborers. And you will also very frequently hear them crying, saying that, hey, we're running out of cash, do something, right? Now, if we consider that $3.2 per day as a poverty line, which is ideally the case for a lower middle income country like India, and I also strongly feel that's like somewhere between an ethical poverty line. According to that, if you consider that, and let's assume that the migrants, whatever cash reserve the migrants had, or any informal worker had, the bottom 47 percentile population, or 500 millions of Indians, would have run out of all their cash reserve by April 15, which is the first phase of lockdown of 21 days. And now, when an additional 19 days is added, and when the lockdown gets lifted on May 4th, 1 billion of Indians would have run out of all their cash reserve they had over the last 22 years. So what it goes to say is, the Indians, I mean, majority of Indians only had so much of cash for them to have sustained just floating above the poverty line for 40 days. So here, when you talk about this number, I just want to dissect it again for you. 1 billion population running out of cash by the end of 40 days. And within that 1 billion, half of them, that is 500 million of them, will be running on a deficit. So this kind of tells us about the complete failure of addressing structural inequality over these many years. Now, again, I want to take you back to that old number that I gave, which is the Indian economy had actually grown 10 times since 1993. And yet the majority of the population, and a whopping 1 billion population, was still living closer to poverty line. Now, what are the consequences of this? The first, let's just take the economic impact of things. That is, it is going to affect the real wages. Now, this is, this is going to further decline. It's not as if it was, it was a very high figure at any point of time. And the second thing is, to make good for those loss in real wages, they will have to work extra hours. And again, it's not as if they were not doing extra hours. When human minds are subjected to a whole lot of tragedy, and particularly it is a collective tragedy, it will mold itself. Now, it will adjust itself. Now, what trajectory it will take is a function of the society that we live in. And unfortunately, we're not living at a time where compassion is the key. In fact, we're living at a time of unprecedented hatred. So I strongly believe that this is going to manifest in a social catastrophe if you don't address it at this point of time. So as aspiration to a better life becomes distant, it will develop new political emotions, and which can actually be turned against a particular community, or race war, or class war. and the desire to outdo others. And because many people will also see this as an opportunity to kind of outdo a particular, a close class. Now, if, so unless or otherwise the government's actually kind of step up right now and seen doing to deliver minimum justice, I think in long run or even in short run is going to threaten the democracy as we know, will lead to the rise of the far right, and people losing their faith in public institutions. Now, that will essentially lead us from an age of hatred to age of unprecedented violence. Now, I'd like to take to the last section of this brief conversation that I want to have with you is what are the potential ways in which we can handle it. Now, these are not the perfect solutions, but in short run, I think we got to introduce some sort of universal basic income that help people tide over this this current crisis. Now, we're already hearing people talking about quantitative easing. I just want to warn you of what happened towards quantitative easing in the United States. It led to further increase of salaries of the top 1% and did not percolate it down to the bottom of the pyramid. And in the medium and long term, this pandemic has actually shown how the complete collapse of public institutions. The state has to reclaim its place in healthcare, education, and the basic essential public services. And then the question will again arise of how we're going to fund it. And I think it's time the governments have to seriously think of addressing, more progressive taxation to be seen. And that, I think I'm stressing on those words, seen, to be doing to deliver minimum justice and not to be rushing up to help the corporates. And it's perfect. I also want to kind of emphasize the fact that the corporates need to kind of understand at this point of time that inequality is bad for business. And I just want to demonstrate in the case of India. When the lockdown is lifted on May 4th, what you will see is India has been, the Indian corporates have been benefiting from the huge number. It's not that they have a huge margin, but the volumes kind of make up for the margin. But what you will see post May 4th is that 1 billion or roughly 87% population or the customer, let's call them in the language that the corporates will understand, 87% of their customers will be without any buying capacity. So all those investments that's been made, thinking about this huge customer base based on debt and things like that, is going to be unutilized. So this is bad business. Even for the corporate to kind of, so this time we really have to do stimulus package to the bottom of the pyramid. And I think this pandemic is kind of taken us to a point where we need to question ourselves and across all the stakeholders, be the corporate, government, activism, and everybody have to come out and kind of reconcile and to find a new social contract in which basic human rights, environment, and reasonable level of profit have to find a common ground in the sense like a society that delivers minimum justice. And on that note, I'm leaving you right here, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Appu. That's the data that you have presented is astounding, even for someone who is working in India and on inequality issues. I hope I'm audible. Thank you, guys. Thank you to the panel for such interesting and valuable talks. We're quickly going to go into questions. We don't have, unfortunately, we're running over, so we don't have a lot of time. But you guys are more than welcome to stay back after 9 o'clock. I know the event was just for 1.5 hours. So please, anyone who's willing to stay back, who has time, still wants to engage with the speakers, can, and hopefully the speakers can stay back for a little long too. So I'm just going to go with some questions. Melvin from Kenya says that lockdown is not actually a luxury. People are being evicted and losing their jobs. So, probably Saida and Kripa, there's also a question on the impact of gender inequality that this lockdown is having. So maybe we'll take some questions and then I'll come back with some more.
Yeah, so thanks, Priyanka, and thanks, Melvin from Kenya. It's true that, again, because of what what we've said about the loss of livelihoods, loss of incomes for some of the families that are living already are marginalized or are living in poverty, and multiple inequalities. Because of lack of income, then some of them are not able to pay for rent. And we've seen places where people have said that their landlords have written to them and said that they understand what's going on, and so they are willing to wait and see how things go. But there are places where people have been evicted. Now, I want to connect the issue of eviction to the situation, the gendered situation here, is that we have a lot of female-headed households, for instance. There are people who've been isolated in ways that they've been targeted. In Kenya specifically, the Chief Justice in the first statement he gave about how the judiciary was going to work, he did point out that the cases of sexual violence in Kenya have increased, and it's true. It's not just sexual violence, but there are other forms of intimate partner violence that have increased. We've just 2 days ago, someone called me and said that in their neighborhood, a woman was found early morning by the roadside. Apparently she'd been gang raped. And these are the situations of women who are isolated because either they live alone or they had families where they have children, and so there is no other adult, and where everyone is minding their business because of the curfew and making it easy for some people to be attacked. In terms of sexual violence, actually for Kenya, the situation is also that it's not just sexual violence by people that the victims don't know. This is happening at the family or the home setting. And so basically what we are saying in relation to gender-based violence and other gendered situations is that because of isolation and the quarantine or the measures that now people have to be isolated, when you think about the different vulnerable groups, think about the girls, adolescent girls. We are concerned about the rise in unintended pregnancies, some of them perhaps because of violence, or others because then people are just isolated in ways that children, and I've seen cases of some girls in places like Kisumu, where even one of our other senior fellows, Roslyn, I don't know whether she's on the call, but basically we have girls in the lakeside region where they are now engaging in prostitution, and I want to put that in quotes, in order to get some income to cater for their families. We know about the situation of health workers and the fact that majority of health workers, and I'm talking about the formal health workers, are female, which means that there are more of them that are exposed to whatever health situation here if they do not have protective equipment, or if we do not have enough attention being paid to their psychosocial support. The kind of mental illness or mental impact that is beginning to emerge, not just for health workers, but also for women at the margins that are supporting their communities, women that are working with widows, that are supporting people who already have things such as HIV or people living with HIV, women who are the main caregivers or seen as main caregivers. And I just want to point out, and perhaps some of the readings that we will provide through the AFSI website, is that there are lessons for us in sub-Saharan Africa because of Ebola outbreak. So how prepared are our governments, and how are they responding in ways that are actually informed by what happened before? In 2014, when Ebola broke out in West Africa, the kinds of things we saw is that women were completely exposed because of the increased caring responsibilities. Then the health workers as well, and we lost lots of health workers. So by 2018, or 2016 going to 2018 when it was emerging in DRC, the WHO and the kinds of things that had been learned from West Africa really helped in the kinds of responses we saw in DRC, and that continue to be in place to be able to identify in case any of those cases is seen or arises. And these are the kinds of things we are saying need to happen to address not just the gendered aspects alone, but really survival of everyone at the community level. In terms of gender-based violence, we actually have feminists globally and even now in Kenya that are calling out for the government to consider having responses to GBV as part of the main package of how response is happening. Because it's not enough to give people food if they are living with someone who is a threat to everyone and the family. So what kind of safe corridors are we going to have opened up or initiated, hotlines and things like that, that people can discreetly call? But then again, if you think about the communities that Tracy was talking about even in South Africa, because yes, I know it's not a one size fits everyone, but basically when we talk about those high density communities, it is the same for us in Kenya as well. So when you think about what Tracy was saying, how is a woman who is living with an intimate partner who is violent going to even get the space to call and say, I need to be helped? But we also know we can learn from others that are already doing it. And so these are some of the things we're saying. It is very gendered in what we are seeing emerge. I saw a question about why are Black communities more affected? And this again, I just want to say, from the onset when we started talking about this, even Priyanka, the kind of briefing you were giving of India, when you think about the social and economic inequalities that exist, for us, we're not just thinking about just that in one way. We're thinking about the multiple forms of inequalities and how they converge. And we know that there are racial inequalities that make it very difficult for some of the Black communities to even access health. It's the same for women, and the examples that Kripa was giving of pregnant women. Access to health, if you're already in a situation where under what is known as the normal, you cannot access that, this just complicates those inequalities. Perhaps Kripa, you want to add, or Priyanka?
Hi, sorry. Thanks, Saida. We're just going to jump to another question for Kripa. Is the crisis creating a window of opportunity for policy changes from Armina?
Thank you for the question. I would say that there's already an economic recession, and which might force the government to think differently, not just for Nepal but other countries as well. We are doing something wrong, really wrong, which is impacting people at the bottom. So COVID-19 actually pushes us to reimagine a different economic system, which can work for all and not just top 1%. The new economic system should work for people at the bottom who are forced to be at the bottom. So there was a report from World Bank which said that remittance to Nepal is expected to drop by 14% this year. Which is already signaling an economic distress stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you see, our total GDP consisted of 31% of remittance. Because of remittance, it consisted of 31% of GDP. So it'll force Nepal to think differently in terms of how policy can be designed. And also Nepal is more remittance and agriculture based country. So this also kind of pushes us to focus on agriculture now and make it more decent and dignified in thoughts. There were recent orders from Supreme Court and National Human Rights Commission to accept migrant workers and ensure that there's diplomatic measures taken to ensure human rights conditions. But sadly, it's not practiced till now. Our Prime Minister said that this is not the time to get emotional and implement Constitution's provision and exercise right to mobility, which is, I know, problematic. And the concern with, using migrant welfare fund is only applicable to documented migrant workers. So what does that mean to undocumented migrant workers, where mostly women take that channel, where their mobility is again curtailed and banned? They can't even go to West Asian countries because domestic workers are banned, and mostly 99% are women. So what is the impact on them is that due to lockdown, they are working for almost 16 to 18 hours every day. Previously, they used to work for 12 hours. Even 12 hours is long. So, it's all about powerlessness, and also maybe economy, crashing down economy might force the government to think differently. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kripa. I'm just going to jump in here for Priyanka. So I've got another question here from Caroline. How can people in the developed world support and endorse change? She's frustrated and angry because all she can do is send money to friends in Kenya and South Africa, and feels like this is creating a reliance on the system and a sense of charity and friendship. I wonder if Tracy, would you be up for answering that one?
Sorry, Jack, would you mind asking the question again?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So the question is, how can people in the developed world support and endorse change? Is the main question. How can people do that without feeling like you're just supporting the current system by continuing to send money back in a kind of charitable way? Maybe Appu, you could jump in there as well if you'd like.
Yeah, gosh, that's a massive question. It's difficult for me to speak about people in the developed world. So I'll speak to the context that I'm much more familiar with. I think, the concept of endorsing change, I think, starts with having an opportunity to influence what that change is. So creating space for communities who are the most vulnerable communities, and often the object of big policy changes, creating space for them to actually have some influence and say in what those policy changes are. And I think Rose asked a question about trust between citizens and the state. And in South Africa, that's been one of the biggest challenges to our democracy and to equality, is a breakdown of trust between communities and government. So, and it's something that takes time to repair, but there are opportunities for government to do that, to create those spaces and to enable communities to actually understand how decisions get made and where they have an opportunity to influence those decisions. So I think the issue of agency and building agency is really important. Intermediaries play a role in that, but I think the onus is on government to also to enable that and provide communities with information and to take their input seriously and have it seriously influence the way policies are made and what policy decisions are actually determined at all levels, at local, provincial, and national level. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that's just, when I think about what people can do to endorse change, I think it's being part of the change is a fundamental criterion for that.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Tracy. Appu, I wonder, do you have would would you have anything to comment on that that question as well?
Again, like I don't have a particular context of in terms of how the developer world feels about endorsed change, but I think what is kind of important is that the developed world have a lot of responsibility in terms of ensuring the inequality, like just the basics, like if you start purchasing clothes or clothes if that come from Bangladesh and India, if you just want to ensure that there's a certain level of ethical standards of wages have been maintained, or human rights is maintained, I think that's a great beginning.
Okay, great. I think Priyanka's not quite back yet here, so I think I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thank you very, very much to everyone for coming along and for giving your time on a Saturday to come and listen to the speakers. One more time, I'd like to say just a huge thanks to all the speakers for coming here today, which is Saida, Kripa, Appu, and Tracy, and to Priyanka as well, and and everybody else actually who's contributed to this project so far. We're going to be back again, hopefully next Saturday or within a week. We're looking to program a series more talks together, and we'll keep in touch and let you know how it all develops. And like I say, really, we're really keen to keep in touch with people and to build and develop on these ideas. And we hope to see you very soon. So thanks again to everyone, and see you soon.